Creating beautiful patterns is easy with this fun kiln-formed glass technique. Since the finished glass object will be thicker than 6 mm, I will need to restrict the flow of the glass when it fuses. To accomplish this, I'll be using primed molite dams. Using primed dams will restrict the glass flow and result in relatively smooth surface along the edges of my finished piece. This smoother surface reduces the need for cold working. I prime and dry my dams according to the primer manufacturer's directions. Once my dams are dry, I scrape all the edges to remove any dried drips of shelf primer. The dried drips will prevent the dams from standing level on the kiln shelf and forming a tight intersection when assembled in a pinwheel formation. I'm being careful not to scratch the surface of the dams when doing this. Now I can pick my colors. For this project, I'm using Wissmach's new Sky Blue Opal, Oyster Pearl, Gold Tone, Superior Blue, and Pale Green. I drew a rough template of the shapes I plan to use for this project on the glass. The glass will be stacked into several pyramids and allowed to flow when heated to just above a full fuse. I will also be using 2 layers of glass to create my base. One layer of Sky Blue Opal and the other of Oyster Pearl. The flow will be restricted by the primed dams and create the pattern for the piece. You could see that the biggest pieces or bases of my pyramids will be Sky Blue Opal, and the smallest or the tips will be Oyster Pearl. Then I begin the project by tracing my templates on the glass. Next, I score the straight cuts on each color of glass. I like to make all of my scores at once before proceeding to run them all. Then, using running pliers, I run the scores to separate the individual pieces of glass. Next, I score the curved lines for each piece. I'll skip this step for the smallest Oyster Pearl pieces. I'll form them in a different manner later. For the curved scores, I use grazing pliers to nip the scored portions. I'm not concerned about making perfect shapes for this project. I find imperfect shapes can make just as beautiful a finished pattern as perfectly cut shapes can. Now for the small Oyster Pearl shapes. I find it easier to just nip the corners of each piece with grazing pliers rather than scoring them with a glass cutter. Now that all my glass is cut, I need to clean it well before assembling. I will also clean the 2 pieces of glass that will make up my base. When all of my glass is clean, I'm ready to start assembling the project on my kiln shelf. I like to set up 2 of the primed dams in a pinwheel formation as a jig. First, I lay my Blue Sky Opal base piece, followed by my Oyster Pearl base piece. Then I follow with the pieces to make the pyramids, starting with the Sky Blue Opal. Once the Sky Blue Opal is laid, I proceed to the Gold Tone. Next, the Superior Blue, the Pale Green, and finally, the Oyster Pearl tips. After all of my glass has been assembled, I pinwheel the last 2 primed dams. To help ensure the glass does not stick to the dams, creating needle points, I'm leaving a 1/16 inch gap between the glass and the dams to allow a tiny amount of flow. You can see the small gaps in the video. Then, I fire my glass to this kiln schedule. Once the kiln has cooled to room temperature, I can remove the dams and inspect my piece. The edges are smooth and free of needle points. Notice the chemical reaction lines where the Sky Blue Opal interacts with the Oyster Pearl and the Gold Tone. A similar reaction line can be seen where the Pale Green and Oyster Pearl interact. I'm a big fan of glass with a matte finish, so I decided to sandblast the piece using 120 grit aluminum oxide before slumping. After sandblasting, I clean the piece again and place it on a mold in preparation to slump it. I'm aiming for a relatively matte fire polish to the finished piece, which will be perfect for the temperature needed to slump into this rectangular form. Using this kiln schedule, I slump and fire polish my piece. Once the kiln is cool, I can inspect the fire polished finish. It's a beautiful matte finish, exactly what I was hoping for. By heating the glass to above a full fuse and allowing it to flow in a restricted way, you can create beautiful patterns that explore color and style.